So today I'm going to show you how to do a gradient style dyeing of yarn. So it would basically be one long gradient like this, where it starts out at one color, and as you knit or crochet along, it goes into a different color. It's actually really simple to do. What you're going to need is yarn, wool, obviously, or something that's at least 75% wool. And we're just going to roll it up into a big giant ball like this. And you need it in a ball, not in a cake or any other form, because putting it in a ball changes the way that it absorbs the color. And for the color, we're going to use just plain old food dye. I got this just at local craft store. It's pretty cheap. But the reason I'm using a food dye instead of an acid dye is because the food dye actually has so many varied colors in it that it's going to absorb those colors at different rates and will give you that really nice gradient look with all the different colors soaking through it. And as for how much dye, that really varies so much depending on how much yarn you're using, the weight of the yarn, the thickness, all that kind of stuff. So for this yarn, I'm actually going to be using two colors. So it's going to be this same color setup. So starting at, this is actually a black, oddly enough, starting at a black and going to this golden yellow. So I'm going to want to use enough of the dye to do just less than half of my yarn. You don't want it to fully saturate. So really what you're going to want to do is kind of start out with a little bit less than you normally would use if you're used to dyeing yarn. If not, I'd say a good starting point. I usually use 1/8 of a teaspoon. Start out with about that. And see, you can always add more. You can't really take out dye. And of course with this style, you don't want it fully saturated. You want the gradual change of color and the different shades to come through. So we've put the dye in. There's also vinegar in there. So then we're just going to take your ball of yarn and drop it in carefully. Since the water is hot, you don't want it boiling, but you do want it hot. So see, it's steaming, not boiling, because the boiling will potentially felt your yarn, which is not happy. So we're just going to let that sit and absorb. Every now and then kind of take some tongs and kind of twirl it around so that all of the sides are equally absorbing, because the stuff on the bottom won't absorb quite as well because it's sitting up next to the pan rather than being surrounded by the fluids. So we'll just let that sit for a while and absorb. All right, so it's been about 20 minutes. As you can see, there's still tons of dye left in the water, but it's absorbing it quite nicely. You can see there's lots of varying shades in there, and it's getting down in there. There's still lots of white to go, so we're gonna keep letting this sit. Give it a nice little turn so that it's all evenly exposed to the dye, and we'll come back in a little while later and check on it again. All right, so it's been about another 20 minutes or so. There's still tons of dye in the water, so it's definitely not done, but as you can see, oops, the outside has definitely absorbed a lot more. But you move aside and you can see these inner layers are not quite there. So I'm actually going to add a little bit more vinegar to kind of just help the process along. And really I don't measure because, well, I'm lazy, I guess. So we'll just kind of let that mix in and let it continue absorbing all that color. All right, so it's been yet another 20 minutes, maybe 30, but there's still tons of color in the water, but you can see these outside layers are getting really saturated with color. And as I move them aside, you can see the inner layers are definitely getting more color as well. This process really is going to vary a lot on how long it's going to take depending on what color of dye you use, the thickness of your yarn, the weight of your yarn, or how much yarn you have. This is about 200 grams of worsted weight, so there's a lot of layers for this color to go through, so it's definitely going to take some time. I'm going to continue leaving it because it's definitely getting close. With any of these food coloring dyes that have blue in them, it's going to take a lot longer than if you were to do, say, yellow or something like that. For some reason the blue just does take a long time. If adding more vinegar doesn't seem to help, what you can do is remove it from the heat, let it cool down, and as it cools, it will absorb more of that color. So actually I'm going to go ahead and do that, see where we're at once all the rest of this dye is absorbed. Alright, so this is all cooled off. There's still a little bit of blue left. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see in there's just a tiny bit left in the water. But that's not a huge deal. If we pull this out, we can see it's definitely absorbed a lot of color. So let's kind of look a little deeper inside and see what it looks like. You can kind of pull these layers apart and see that it saturates down and gets lighter and lighter and lighter. Looks like it'll probably go pretty close to halfway. So that is perfect. So I will take this out of the water now, let it drain a little bit, squeeze out some of the extra water, and then we will wash it, or rinse it at least, and get going on the other color. Alright, so we are here at the sink. We're just going to kind of give this yarn a bit of a rinse. You don't need to wash it just yet. We'll do that all the way at the end, but we want just kind of some of that excess dye. You can see there's just teeny tiny tinge of blue. So we're just going to kind of give it a rinse, squeeze it around a little bit, get out some of that extra dye. And then I'm going to take this colander, let it sit in there, and then just kind of put my bowl on top and give it a squeeze. Get some of that extra water out. We don't need it dry because we're just going to dye it again, but since we're going to be unwinding it and winding it up again, we don't want a ton of excess water splashing all over because, well, that's kind of messy. So we'll let that sit for just a bit. Then we'll come back and unwind it and wind it up again. Alright, so I started rewinding the ball of yarn into a different ball, starting to grab the outside of the yarn and started winding it up. And you can really see all the varying colors that we have here. It's going to get lighter and lighter as we go through this ball. So you just start at the beginning or the outside end of the yarn and start rolling it into a new one and just keep going. This is kind of one of the most time-consuming parts about making this gradient style of dyed yarn, is all of the winding and unwinding that you have to do. It definitely, I mean, I've had it take anywhere from 2 to 4 days to go through the whole entire process between winding, unwinding, dyeing, and then drying. So it's definitely takes a bit of time. So you can see we're starting to get some of these lighter colors in here. And this is really going to vary a lot depending on the thickness of your yarn. I mean, a bulky yarn is going to dye up a lot differently than a sock yarn or sport weight, just because, you know, the more layers of yarn it has to go through, the more varying the colors are going to be. So it's really just kind of a experiment almost. You know, you kind of never quite know how it's going to turn out. Any yarn dyeing that you do is going to be just kind of more of an art than a science. You can come up with some really, really crazy results. When I first did this one, I did not at all expect this black to turn out the way it did, which actually is a lot of fun. I kind of like it. It's my favorite color to use for this gradient style of dyeing. So there you have it. I'm just going to keep up with this, rolling up the yarn, and I'm also going to go feed my hungry baby who thinks she needs more food. So I will be back. Alright, I am about halfway done now. I know this because I found the knot, because I am doing 200 grams instead of 100, which means I basically just took 2 things of yarn and tied them together. But as you can see, this is pretty well gone. I mean, there'll be a tiny bit more blue, just some spots here and there, but it's gone through pretty much half of it. I ended up using a 1/4 teaspoon of dye to do approximately 100 grams. So that's kind of a good starting point. If you're only doing 100 grams total, 1/4 teaspoon of dye is probably going to be adequate. So again, start out with less than you think you might want, because you can always add dye, but you can't take it away. But yeah, so it looks like there's definitely some great color variances in here. It's going to continue having just those little spots of blue. On the other end, we're going to do a golden yellow, which when it mixes up with these spots of blue will make a really cool green color. So it's got a really, really great effect. So I'm going to continue winding this and get ready to dye the other end. Alright, so we are ready to dye the second color of our yarn. I'm going to be using this, can you see it? Golden yellow here. I'm going to go ahead and do 1/4 of a teaspoon, about the same amount that I did on the previous and the black, because I know that's basically going to get me to just over halfway, which will get a great blend of colors right in the middle. And this stuff doesn't want to dissolve, so I'm just going to kind of give it a little whisk. Alright, and I've already put some vinegar in, so all that's left to do is take our dye, or our yarn, and carefully place it in. Actually, I'm going to add a little bit more water to this because, as you can see, it's not quite covered, and then we will just leave this on a low heat. You don't want it boiling again because, well, that could felt your yarn, and no one wants that. So we're just going to leave it on a low heat, hot enough to set the dye, but not hot enough to boil. And we'll let that sit for a while and come back and check on it. Okay, it's been about half an hour. Looks as though a lot of the color has been absorbed, but it's not nearly as dark as I would like. So I'm going to go ahead and add a tad bit more color here. Probably just go ahead and go with another 1/8 of a teaspoon because I want this to be a nice dark orange. And I'm gonna have to get a whisk and get that mixed in. Sometimes this gel dye doesn't like to dissolve. Okay, that's pretty good. So we will let that sit a little while longer and come back at some point and check on it again. Alright, so we are pretty well done here with the dye. You can see it's definitely absorbed most of the color, and really I'm going to say that's probably good enough. Put it here in a bowl and kind of just take a look, move things around. You can see it gets this great golden yellow mixed in with some of these flecks of blue. So it's actually going to look really, really cool. So I am going to let this cool down a bit, and then we will wind it up on the yarn winder and get it washed and ready to go. All right, so we've got our yarn now all dyed, ready to go. I'm gonna go ahead and get some lukewarm water because you don't want to get too cold if it's still warm, because that will shock it and potentially felt it, and we don't want felted balls of yarn because what would you do with that? So we're just gonna rinse it off a little bit, just kind of squeeze, get some of that excess dye off in case there is any, and this doesn't seem to have any. So, and again, we'll just kind of squeeze out the excess water and just get as much of that out because we're going to now wind it up and let it dry. And the more water that's out of it, the better it will be. Alright, so that's probably pretty good. And we'll get out the yarn swift and wind it up and be ready to go. Alright, so I've got my yarn all wound up here on the yarn swift, and you can see kind of the progression of color. Kind of starts out with this bold orange, gold, light yellow, mixes with the blue, and it gets darker to almost black. So we're going to take this string and just kind of wrap it in there, tie it around, and this will help keep it from getting tangled up when it's drying. And then we'll pull this off the yarn swift and I'll give you a better view of what it looks like. Okay.
Your yarn swift.
So here's our yarn. You can really see the progression of colors here, and it's going to knit up or crochet either way. Really, really beautiful. So we'll let this dry. It'll probably take 1 to 2 days. It's a lot of yarn. And then I will show you what it looks like when it's all dried. Okay, so I lied. There's still one more thing left to do. We have to wash it. So just fill up your sink with warm water. Not too hot, not too cold. You can really use just about anything to wash your wool yarn. Obviously there's products designed specifically for that. I usually like to use something as simple as, you know, hand soap, dish soap, body wash, shampoo, you name it. Basically, if it's okay for you to use, it's probably okay for your yarn. So fill this up a little bit, toss in a little squirt of soap. And you don't want to work the yarn too much. You don't want it to get tangled. You don't want it to get felted. We're just going to kind of swish it around, and you can see there's a little bit of that residual yarn or dye that's getting washed out. Okay, so we'll just kind of smush it around. This is why we don't want the temperature of the water hot, because if we have it hot and then we're agitating the yarn, it's just gonna felt. Alright, so we'll go ahead and let that drain. And rinse it a bit. All that extra soap and dye out. It seems to be rinsing pretty clear, so I think we are good. Continue letting that sink drain. Oh. Alright, the other thing I like to do is just kind of wrap it around there and give it a good twist. Just get out all that extra water, help it dry a lot faster. Another thing you can do is kind of twist it up like that. Wrap a towel around it and then step on the towel. That'll help push out all that extra water as well, so you can really see these great colors. It's so cool. I'm very excited with how it turned out. So hopefully my customer will be as well. So now that we've washed it, we will go ahead and let it dry, and then we will see the finished product. So our yarn is all dry, ready to go. You can see really well the gradient here with the orange getting lighter and then to a light blue and finally that dark blue. Let's go ahead and unwind it here, and you can see the full color. So there we go. Got this bright orange at this end and going all the way to this great dark navy here. So this is going to work out really neat when it's done. So it's ready to go, ready to be made into a project. If you make a yarn using this technique, I would love to see how it turns out. You can post a photo on my Facebook page and show me a picture, and I would love it. So good luck, have fun, and enjoy.